Now let's talk about the rules for validity of categorical syllogism. When we say a statement is categorical, it means that it directly asserts a fact without any conditions. Here are some examples of categorical statements. You may pause this video and observe that in each statement, the subject is simply affirmed by the predicate without any conditions. The quality of a categorical syllogism may be affirmative or negative. A statement with terms no, not, none, and never is negative, and in the absence of such terms, the statement is affirmative. Here are some examples of affirmative statements and negative statements. You may pause this video and observe their differences. The quantity of a categorical syllogism is either universal, which is sometimes called distributed, or particular, which is sometimes called undistributed. The statement is universal when what is being affirmed or denied of the subject term is its whole extension. The statement is particular when what is being affirmed or denied is just a part of its extension. Here are some examples of universal statements and particular statements. You may pause this video and observe their differences. Note that the predicate of a negative statement is always universal, while the predicate of an affirmative statement is always particular. There are three kinds of statements in a categorical syllogism: the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. There are also three terms in a categorical syllogism: the major term, which is the predicate of the conclusion, the minor term, which is the subject of the conclusion, and the middle term, which is the term found in both premises. Let us designate color yellow for the major term, color red for the minor term, and color violet for the middle term. Here's an example for the statements and terms of categorical syllogism. You may pause this video and observe each of them. Now that you know the properties and parts of a categorical syllogism, let's now tackle the rules for validity of categorical syllogisms. Rule number 1. There should only be three terms in the syllogism, namely the major term, the minor term, and the middle term. And the meaning of the middle term in the first premise should not be changed in the second premise. Otherwise, the syllogism will have four terms. For example, selling cigars to a person below 18 years is unlawful. That store sold cigars to a student below 18 years. Therefore, the store has violated the law. This syllogism is valid since the terms below 18 years was used in the same sense in both premises. Note that a violation of this rule is referred to as the fallacy of equivocation. In a fallacy of equivocation, the meaning of the middle term shifted in the course of the argument. Here are some examples of arguments under the fallacy of equivocation, thus making them invalid. You may pause this video and observe that in each of these arguments, the meaning of the middle term in the first premise is different in the second premise. Rule number 2. If the term in the conclusion is universal, the same term in the premise must also be universal. For example, all Bicolanos are Filipinos. Bicolanos are not Cebuanos. Therefore, Cebuanos are not Filipinos. In the first premise, Bicolanos is universal, but Filipinos are particular, because while all Bicolanos are Filipinos, only some Filipinos are Bicolanos. Also, remember that the predicate of an affirmative statement is always particular. Thus, Filipinos, the major term, is used in a particular mode. In the second premise, both Bicolanos and Cebuanos are used universally. In other words, no Bicolano is Cebuano, or no Cebuano is Bicolano. The use of no or not make a term universal. So while the premises are true, the conclusion is false. The major term, Filipinos, is universal in the conclusion, but particular in the premise. Thus, the argument is invalid. Note that this is the fallacy of illicit major. Let's have another example for rule number 2. All lawyers are bar passers. All lawyers are professionals. Therefore, all professionals are bar passers. In the second premise, professional, the minor term, is particular. In the conclusion, professional is universal. A universal conclusion was arrived at from a particular term in the minor premise. This is a fallacy of illicit minor, thus invalid. Rule number 3. The middle term must be universal at least once. For example, all criminals have tattoos. John has a tattoo. Therefore, John is a criminal. The middle term tattoo, which appears in both premises, remain particular. Thus, it cannot be universalized in the conclusion that just because John has a tattoo, he is necessarily a criminal. Note that this is a fallacy of undistributed middle. Thus, it is invalid. Rule number 4. The syllogism must not contain two negative premises. For example, no lunatic is rational. Kurt is not a lunatic. Therefore, Kurt is rational. Obviously, we cannot draw a valid conclusion from the negative premises. Thus, this argument is invalid. Rule number 5. At least one premise must be universal. For example, all lawyers are bar passers. Some lawyers are artists. Therefore, some artists are bar passers. Here, since one of the premises is universal, then the argument is valid. Rule number 6. If one premise is particular, the conclusion must be particular. For example, all lawyers are bar passers. Some lawyers are artists. Therefore, all artists are bar passers. Here, one of the premises is particular. Thus, the conclusion must be particular. So in this case, since the conclusion is a universal statement, then this argument is invalid. So those are the rules for validity of categorical syllogism. I hope that you will take time to master these rules. Thanks for listening.